Every man dreams of escape, but only one ever planned it perfectly. He ordered a bourbon, wrote a note, and bought his way off the edge of the world. No mask, no accomplice, just a calm voice, a black tie, and a plan drawn in pure control. He didn't steal for greed. He did it to disappear. What kind of mind believes it can outthink gravity? What kind of man steps through an open door and trusts the darkness to catch him? He called himself Dan Cooper. The world called him legend. And for 50 years, no one has ever proved he was real. The morning of November 24th, 1971, began in a wash of gray light across the Pacific Northwest. Portland was still wet from an overnight drizzle, the streets reflecting blurred halos from traffic lights and neon signs. Thanksgiving sat on the horizon, and travelers moved through the city in waves. Coats buttoned, luggage rolling, conversation soft. By early afternoon, the rain had settled into a thin mist, clinging to glass and asphalt like a film. Inside Portland International Airport, the air smelled of jet fuel, tobacco, and polished floors. Loudspeakers carried the rhythm of boarding calls and distant static, layered over the echo of footsteps and suitcase wheels. Travelers queued at counters beneath the fluorescent hum. It was an ordinary Wednesday, unremarkable in every sense, until a man stepped through the main doors carrying a small black attaché. He paused under the terminal clock, checked the time, and adjusted the cuff of his shirt with unhurried precision. He looked like any mid-level businessman passing through the Pacific Corridor. A man neither remarkable nor forgettable. His suit was dark and neatly pressed, tailored but modest. A white shirt framed his tie, black and narrow, the knot pulled tight against his throat. His hair was combed straight back, brown with traces of gray catching the artificial light. A faint shadow of stubble traced his jaw, clean but not meticulous. He moved with measured confidence, his shoes clicking against the tiles as if every step was rehearsed. At the Northwest Orient Airlines counter, he stood behind a family and waited without expression. When his turn came, he placed a $20 bill on the counter and asked for a one-way ticket to Seattle. Flight 305. The transaction lasted seconds. The clerk later remembered his politeness, his steady posture, and the way he tucked the ticket stub neatly into his inside jacket pocket before turning away. He didn't rush, didn't hesitate, and didn't check his surroundings. He crossed the concourse to the bar. The smell of whiskey, heavy in the air. He ordered a drink, sat for a few minutes, and watched planes through the glass. Rain streaked across the windows in long diagonal trails. The announcer's voice echoed overhead. Final call for several afternoon departures. When he finished his drink, he placed a few bills on the counter, stood, and collected his attaché. No one noticed him leave. Security in 1971 was a formality. There were no scanners, no bag checks, no identification verification beyond a ticket stub. He walked directly through the gate corridor, with the same calm precision he had carried since entering the building. His boarding pass was punched without pause. To the gate agent, he was one of 40 passengers, headed north. A businessman catching a short flight before the holiday. As he stepped into the Boeing 727, the hum of the engines filled the narrow cabin. The air inside was dense with cigarette smoke and the smell of synthetic upholstery. Laughter and conversation floated softly between rows. He scanned the cabin with a slow, deliberate glance, then moved down the aisle until he reached row 8, near the rear, close to the aft staircase that opened directly from the tail. A feature known to few outside of aviation. He stowed his attaché carefully on the floor beside him and settled into the aisle seat. From this vantage, he could see the entire cabin reflected in the overhead compartments. Faces, gestures, light. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, performing pre-flight checks, their smiles mechanical but steady. He sat motionless, his hands folded loosely in his lap. The cabin noise rose and fell around him. The sound of safety belts, clicking and newspapers rustling. Outside, the light dimmed as a low front drifted across the sky. The rain intensified, pattering against the fuselage. The man leaned slightly, adjusting the air vent above his seat, then drew from his jacket pocket a small pack of Raleigh cigarettes. He lit one with a match, exhaled a controlled stream of smoke, and rested the cigarette in the ashtray built into the armrest. He looked neither anxious nor distracted, only composed, as if this quiet anonymity suited him. The captain's voice echoed faintly from the intercom, announcing taxi clearance. The aircraft trembled as it pushed back from the gate, the engines deepening into a low, resonant growl. The man reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a slip of paper, a ticket stub folded around another smaller piece of stationery. He checked it briefly, then replaced it, every movement deliberate, unhurried. The flight attendant approached to take beverage requests before takeoff. Her steps balanced against the slight sway of the taxi. He requested a bourbon and soda. When she returned, he accepted it with a nod, lifted it once to his lips, and set it down on the tray. The ice clinked faintly as the aircraft turned onto the runway. Beyond the window, the runway lights glowed through streaks of water. The engines roared as the aircraft began its acceleration, the vibration humming through the metal floor beneath his shoes. The rain outside blurred into white lines of motion as the 727 lifted from the ground. He closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, but in silent acknowledgement, like a ritual marking the beginning of something long planned. Below, the city dissolved into fog and distance. The river wound through it like a gray vein. The aircraft climbed into the overcast, swallowed by clouds, the light dimming to near twilight inside the cabin. Seatbelt signs glowed red above rows of indifferent travelers. The man reopened his eyes, steady, expressionless, and watched the seatbelt light flicker faintly in reflection across his glass. The engines leveled, the shudder of ascent smoothing into the hum of steady flight. The man in seat 18E reached for the attaché beside his feet, adjusting its position by inches, until it rested directly against his right leg. The flight had just begun, but everything that would follow, the ransom, the descent, the mystery that would outlive the century, already existed in his calm, controlled stillness. The other passengers leaned back into routine, magazines unfolded, ice clinking, laughter subdued. The cabin carried the faint electric scent of ozone as the aircraft pierced through a cold front. Outside the window, the world was nothing but white. The man's reflection hovered faintly in the glass, unblinking, detached, and perfectly still. He lifted his glass again, finished the bourbon in 2 slow movements, and looked once more toward the aisle. His expression betrayed no thought, no anticipation, only patience. The aircraft adjusted course slightly, nose dipping through the upper turbulence. The pilot's instruments read steady, 10,000 feet, heading north-northeast. Behind the curtain near the galley, the attendants exchanged quiet signals of routine preparation. From his seat, the man in the dark suit watched the movement, memorizing patterns, where they walked, how they turned, when they paused between rows. He glanced toward the overhead panel, watching the faint flicker of lights that marked cabin functions. Then, almost imperceptibly, he reached for the folded slip of paper in his jacket pocket once more, and set it on the tray. His left hand rested lightly over it, fingertips steady against the surface. The faint vibration of the engines trembled beneath his touch. The note was already written. The aircraft continued north through the fading daylight, unaware that the routine of this short 40-minute flight was minutes away from becoming the most enduring unsolved crime in American history. As the clouds thickened outside, he adjusted his seatbelt, reached for the empty glass, and set it neatly aside. His gaze never left the aisle ahead. Every second of the quiet that filled that cabin, the muted hum, the gentle clatter of trays, the mechanical steadiness of flight was part of the calm before the unraveling. Flight 35 was 20 minutes into its journey, when the man in seat 18E finally shifted his posture, straightened his jacket, and prepared to alter history. The aircraft leveled above the dense ceiling of clouds, steady at 10,000 feet. Turbulence softened into a low vibration that ran through the cabin floor. A soft orange glow filled the interior. The light diffused through the smoke haze from half a dozen cigarettes. The man in seat 18E sat motionless, eyes fixed on the aisle ahead. To anyone watching, he was simply another traveler immersed in thought. The only sign of change came when his right hand moved, slowly, carefully, toward the folded slip of paper resting on his tray. The moment carried no warning. Around him, passengers settled into routine. The shuffle of magazines, the metallic sound of drink carts, the hush of conversation. A flight attendant moved down the aisle, balancing the motion of the plane with practiced rhythm. When she reached his row, he turned slightly, his face calm, and placed the note in her hand. She smiled politely, assuming what every attendant learned to expect from traveling businessmen. She slid it into her pocket and continued forward. A brief pause followed. Then, from his seat, he lifted one hand, gesturing for her to return. The movement was subtle but deliberate. She hesitated, then stepped back toward him. He leaned slightly forward, his expression unchanged, his gaze steady. His lips moved only once, forming quiet words she would remember for the rest of her life. Her eyes widened, her posture stiffened. For a moment she seemed unable to move. Then, guided by instinct, rather than understanding, she slid into the empty seat beside him. The note unfolded between them. On the paper, written in clean block letters, were a few sentences, precise, unemotional, and absolute. Her breathing shifted. The aircraft continued forward through gray air, the sound of the engines unbroken. The man rested his attaché across his knees, unlatched it, and opened it just enough to reveal what lay inside. Red cylinders bound with black tape, wires coiled in deliberate arrangement, the faint metallic glint of a detonator. Whether real or imitation, the effect was the same. The message was clear. He closed the case, clicked it shut, and looked forward again. His posture remained composed, almost formal, as he dictated his next actions, in measured tones. She took notes by hand, writing quickly, her pen trembling. The demands were specific. $200,000 in $20 bills, 4 parachutes, 2 main, 2 reserve, and a fuel truck ready upon landing in Seattle. The precision left no room for negotiation. The attendant folded the note and walked toward the cockpit, her steps careful, her breath shallow, the paper clutched tightly in her hand. Inside the cabin, nothing seemed unusual. The passengers remained oblivious. The man in 18E lifted his glass again, took a measured sip, and watched condensation bead against the side. The stewardess, who had been sitting beside him now, stood several rows ahead, relaying coded signals to the others. They gathered quietly, exchanging brief glances, before one disappeared behind the cockpit door. The captain received the note, unfolded it, and froze. His co-pilot leaned over his shoulder, the words stark under the instrument lights. The decision was immediate. He picked up the radio and transmitted a coded message to Seattle Tacoma Control. The first call to the FBI followed within minutes. In Washington State, agents were pulled from offices, telephones rang without pause, and the name NORJAC, Northwest Hijacking, was entered into an incident log that would remain active for decades. Back in the cabin, Cooper adjusted his tie knot slightly, then loosened it, sliding it down just enough for comfort. His movements were unhurried, detached, almost clinical. He exhaled a steady stream of smoke and watched it curl upward toward the vent. His eyes shifted briefly toward the rear of the plane, then returned to the seat ahead. Nothing about him suggested panic or excitement. He was a man in complete control of his environment, as if this moment had been rehearsed, until no trace of uncertainty remained. The aircraft continued toward Seattle, at a controlled speed, following the flight plan, as if nothing had changed. The cockpit received instructions to maintain course, while negotiations were arranged on the ground. In the aisles, the attendants continued service, their hands trembling only slightly, as they poured coffee and distributed snacks. They spoke softly, their eyes flicking toward the rear seats between movements. The passengers sensed something, a subtle disruption in rhythm, but no one understood its scale. The sky outside turned darker. Through the windows, the fading light drew a thin reflection of cabin silhouettes, faces, glasses, the shimmer of cigarette tips. The air pressure inside the cabin shifted slightly, as the captain reduced altitude. Somewhere behind the cockpit door, voices exchanged short bursts of communication over radio frequencies. Below them, Seattle spread beneath the cloud layer like a constellation of scattered lights. At McCord Air Force Base, agents and technicians assembled stacks of $20 bills from local banks, marking each serial number. The bundles were wrapped in brown paper, sealed with rubber bands, and packed into a canvas bag stamped with the bank's insignia. Each step was documented, photographed, logged. Nearby, 2 parachutes were borrowed from a civilian skydiving school, and 2 from the Air Force Reserve, one later discovered to be an unjumpable dummy, used for instruction. The items were loaded into unmarked vehicles, bound for SeaTac Airport under police escort. On the plane, Cooper remained motionless, his face unreadable. The attendant seated near him studied the outline of his attaché, her thoughts fixed on the threat that might lie inside. She noted the faint movements of his hand, resting on the latch, steady, neither menacing nor relaxed, simply constant. Every few minutes, he asked for a refill of his bourbon. He folded his napkin neatly after each drink, aligning it perfectly with the tray edge. Time passed in slow increments. The passengers grew restless, unaware that the aircraft had entered a holding pattern above Puget Sound. The attendants moved among them with rehearsed calm, explaining the delay as weather-related. Outside, the horizon bled from pale gray into night. The aircraft circled in wide arcs, its navigation lights blinking red and white against the clouds. Below, emergency vehicles gathered at a remote corner of SeaTac's runway. In the command room at the Seattle FBI office, field agents coordinated with air traffic controllers and airline executives. Every decision, how to deliver the ransom, where to position vehicles, how to avoid triggering the hijacker, was weighed in seconds. They chose compliance over confrontation. The risk of a mid-air explosion outweighed any strategy for capture. The cockpit informed Cooper that arrangements were underway. He acknowledged with a nod, his gaze never leaving the aisle ahead. The crew noticed the subtle confidence in his demeanor. He did not fidget, did not look around, did not react to turbulence or time. He sat perfectly upright, his tie loosened, one hand resting lightly over his attaché, the other occasionally lifting a cigarette to his lips. An hour passed, then another. The aircraft maintained its slow, steady loops above Seattle, waiting. In the cabin, the air grew cooler, heavier with smoke. The passengers had fallen into uneasy silence, some dozing, others staring blankly through windows at nothing but darkness. The attendants exchanged fleeting glances, their smiles practiced but strained. The sound of the engines filled every pause, a constant backdrop to the tension that thickened like the air before a storm. When word came through that the ransom and parachutes were ready, the cockpit relayed the message discreetly. Cooper nodded once and leaned back in his seat. His fingers drummed softly against the attache's surface, a rhythm too slow to betray emotion. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, checking his watch briefly before returning his gaze forward. Rain thickened over Seattle-Tacoma Airport, turning the tarmac into a field of reflected light. The aircraft rolled to a slow halt on an isolated stretch beyond the main terminal, where floodlights met darkness. Its engines idled at low power, turbines pulsing like a heartbeat against the metal skin. Outside, vehicles idled with headlights off, their silhouettes faint through the downpour. The control tower watched from a distance, every movement monitored, every sound transmitted over secure lines. Inside the cabin, the passengers waited, restless and unaware. The intercom remained silent. The attendants moved softly among them, smiles strained, gestures deliberate, masking the weight of instruction. Each motion was designed to preserve calm for a situation that no longer had any. The man in seat 18E sat with his attaché closed on his knees, eyes forward, posture unchanged. His composure shaped the air around him, an absence of panic that magnified the unease of everyone who sensed it. The cockpit relayed the arrival of the ransom package. The Boeing's forward door opened with a hiss. Cold air and rain swept inside, carrying the scent of kerosene. Outside, a single airline operations vehicle approached. From its rear compartment, ground personnel lifted a canvas bank bag and a bundle of parachutes. They handed them to an airline representative under the plane's wing, avoiding direct view of the cabin windows. No agents, no weapons, only process. The first officer descended halfway down the stairway, the wind tearing at his uniform, and retrieved the items. He carried them back through the narrow aisle, the bag heavy with cash, water streaking its surface. The attendant guided him with a nod from Cooper's vantage. The hijacker's eyes tracked every movement, unblinking. When the bag reached him, he unfastened the top flap and examined the bundles, brown paper wrappings, rubber bands tied around neat stacks of $20 bills. He lifted one, felt the weight, the crisp texture of new currency. Satisfied, he closed the bag and placed it beside him. Next came the parachutes, 4 in total. 2 sport, 2 reserve. He inspected each harness, each cord, touching the fabric as though confirming the workmanship of something he already knew. One was civilian issue, one military, one smaller than the rest. Unknown to all, one of the reserves had been a training model, sewn shut and never meant to open. None of the crew realized the potential consequence. As he examined the equipment, he gestured toward the attendant nearest the front. She moved quietly down the aisle. At his direction, the passengers would now be released. One by one, they were told to stand, gather their belongings, and exit through the forward stairs into the waiting rain. Their expressions ranged from confusion to relief. Most assumed a delay or inspection. The attendants shepherded them with gentle urgency. Outside, buses idled with doors open, engines running. No one on those buses saw the man in the dark suit. He remained seated, half in shadow, eyes fixed ahead, while freedom flowed out of the plane in a line of human silhouettes. Within minutes, 36 passengers had stepped into the storm and disappeared behind flashing airport vehicles. The cabin fell quiet. Only the crew remained. 3 men in the cockpit, and 1 attendant positioned midway down the aisle. The hijacker leaned back, exhaled smoke, and loosened his collar. The exchange had gone exactly as designed. In the control tower, agents and airline supervisors recorded every motion through binoculars. The Boeing appeared motionless, its beacon lights pulsing red across the wet tarmac. The next phase was fuel. A truck approached under strict instruction to maintain distance. Hoses connected, pumps activated, and fuel hissed through steel lines beneath the wings. Cooper's eyes never left the window. He watched the men outside work under umbrellas, the glint of flashlights bouncing off puddles. Every movement mattered. Any irregularity would break the precision he demanded. Inside the cockpit, the captain awaited the next command. It arrived through a note passed forward from the attendant. Destination, Mexico City. The route required refueling in Reno or Yuma. Cooper selected Reno. He dictated airspeed, altitude, and mechanical settings. Below 10,000 feet. Landing gear extended, flaps set 15 degrees, cabin unpressurized. The specifics betrayed understanding of aircraft performance, far beyond a casual traveler's knowledge. As the fueling concluded, the ground crew disconnected lines and withdrew into darkness. Rain intensified, drumming against the fuselage in relentless rhythm. The hijacker folded his instructions neatly, placed them in his jacket pocket, and adjusted the straps on the 2 parachutes he intended to keep near him. He handed the remaining 2 to the attendant, to store safely in the rear cabin. She obeyed without hesitation, her movements mechanical. The captain's intercom light blinked. The ground tower signaled clearance. In the control room, the FBI monitored every frequency, coordinating with military radar units that would trail the flight once airborne. 2 F-106 interceptors stood ready at McChord Air Force Base. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere was almost ceremonial. Cooper maintained composure that bordered on eerie stillness. The attendant stood a few rows ahead, watching him without meeting his eyes directly. The hum of the engines deepened. As the throttles advanced, the plane began to roll, tires splashing through shallow water. From the outside, it appeared as any routine departure, a commercial jet vanishing into weather. As the aircraft reached the runway threshold, its lights refracted across the soaked asphalt. The hijacker sat back in his seat, one hand resting on the money bag, the other on the attaché still at his side. The engines thundered, vibration building through the cabin floor. Within seconds, the Boeing 727 lifted from the ground once more, slicing into black sky heavy with rain. On the ground, agents watched its silhouette disappear into cloud. They marked the time, 7:36 p.m., and relayed it across radio networks. Within minutes, radar scopes in Seattle, Portland, and McCord displayed a single green trace moving south by southwest, tagged Flight 305, altitude rising steadily. Inside the cabin, Cooper's expression remained unchanged. The exchange had concluded without interference, without violence, without error. The passengers were safe, the money secured, the crew compliant. Every step had unfolded within the margin he had calculated. Now, only the final phase remained. In the cockpit, the pilots maintained the heading he had dictated, their instruments glowing green and amber. Rain swept across the windshield in thin streams. Behind the curtain, the hijacker prepared in silence. The air pressure lowered slightly. The cabin temperature dropped. He reached for the lamp above his seat and switched it off, letting the shadows take the space around him. Below, the ground dissolved into darkness broken only by distant lightning over the Cascades. The hijacker glanced at his watch. Somewhere in the storm ahead lay the next stage of a plan that from the beginning allowed no return. The Boeing 727 cut south through darkness, its navigation lights pulsing red and white across sheets of rain. Below, the Pacific Northwest spread unseen, a black landscape of forests, rivers, and winding mountain roads. Inside the cabin, the engines droned with steady rhythm, their vibration deep and constant through the floor plates. The temperature had dropped. Breath misted faintly in the thin, unpressurized air. In the cockpit, the crew worked by instrument light, eyes fixed on dials that glowed green. In the half-dark, they kept their altitude just under 10,000 feet, speed at 170 knots, exactly as instructed. No one spoke beyond clipped acknowledgments over the interphone. Behind the drawn curtain, the presence of the man who had taken command of their flight pressed against every thought like a weight. At the rear of the plane, Cooper moved methodically. He removed his suit jacket and folded it with deliberate care, laying it across the empty seat beside him. The black tie remained where he had pinned it earlier, clipped neatly to the tray. He rolled his shirt sleeves, checked his watch, then opened one of the parachute packs. Under the cabin light, the white nylon gleamed faintly. He examined the rigging, the straps, the harness rings. His movements were precise, economical, guided by an understanding of process rather than intuition. He chose 2 chutes, the military back and 1 reserve, and positioned them beside the money bag. The others lay untouched on adjacent seats. From one of the unused reserves, he cut a length of cord and used it to bind the canvas bag tightly across his chest. The knots were simple, but secure. He tightened them twice, pulling until the line left faint impressions on his palms. The cabin air grew thinner, colder. He unlatched the briefcase, extracted the red cylinders and wires, and left them visible on the seat. Whether they were functional or not mattered little. The image of them had already served its purpose. He pressed the attaché closed again, and placed it carefully beneath the window. Far ahead, lightning flickered along the horizon, illuminating cloud contours for a fraction of a second, before vanishing back into darkness. The rain returned in bursts, tapping against the fuselage, like static. Each drop streaked backward in the airflow, caught in the lamplight from the wing root, before being swallowed by night. The crew felt the subtle shudder as he unlocked the aft stair mechanism. A red indicator lit on the engineer's panel. Aft stairs, unlatched. They exchanged brief, silent looks. The captain steadied the controls, maintaining altitude. The warning light stayed on. Then came the metallic groan of hydraulics, barely audible through the engine noise. As the rear stairs began to lower into the slipstream, air rushed into the fuselage in a low roar. Papers lifted from seat pockets. Curtains fluttered violently. The cabin temperature plummeted. The attendant nearest the galley braced herself against the wall, hands gripping the frame. She glanced toward the rear, but saw only shadow beyond the curtain. Movement. Then the outline of a figure bent over in preparation. The Boeing center of gravity shifted slightly, forcing the pilots to trim the stabilizer to maintain level flight. The engineer reported an additional drag signature, consistent with the stairs deployed. The airframe vibrated under the increased resistance, the sound like wind tearing through a hollow corridor. Cooper stood near the stairwell, one hand on the rail, the other gripping the strap of the money bag. The air outside howled against the open gap. Moisture condensed instantly on the metal surfaces, forming tiny beads that streaked along the floor. He looked down through the void, into absolute blackness. No horizon, no ground lights, no reference of depth, only darkness and wind. He adjusted his parachute harness, tugged the chest strap until it locked. His shoes were standard loafers, the sole smooth. He tightened them with rough knots of string, torn from the reserve pack. The temperature at altitude hovered just above freezing, the wind speed slicing against exposed skin with invisible blades. The odds of surviving a jump into that terrain at night were almost none, yet there was no pause, no hesitation. At 8:10 p.m., he moved one step lower. The stair plates flexed beneath his weight, metal trembling against the air pressure. Inside the cockpit, the engineer's instruments registered a sharp change in vertical balance. The captain asked for confirmation. The others nodded wordlessly. A moment later, the entire airframe jolted upward. A sudden heavy bump, as if a mass had separated from the rear fuselage. The needle on the altimeter quivered, then stabilized. 8:11 p.m. The moment entered every report, every timeline, every analysis written afterward. The instant the man in the dark suit disappeared from recorded history, the rear stairs remained lowered, their hydraulic system humming faintly. The cabin filled again with the steady resonance of engines, the rush of cold air, and the absence of movement. The attendant sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the narrow aisle. No alarm sounded, no explosion came, only the sound of wind continued, unbroken. Outside, the world below was a mosaic of black forest and silver river. The Columbia snaked westward through the Cascades, reflecting flashes of lightning in fractured arcs. The storm moved east, its rain heavier now, its currents chaotic. If he had fallen into that wilderness, there would be no trace by dawn. The cockpit maintained course toward Reno, as ordered. None of the crew spoke beyond routine confirmations. The air inside the plane was sharp and cold. The engineer's gauge still showed the aft stairway open under aerodynamic load. The pilots engaged minimal climb to compensate for drag. No radar contact reported unusual descent patterns. The trace on scopes remained steady. Below, the wilderness consumed the falling figure. If his parachute opened, it was invisible to radar, and impossible to see through the clouds. The wind would have carried him east across ridges and ravines, into a landscape without roads or witnesses. Every detail of his plan had hinged on this single act, the transition from control to disappearance. At 10:15 p.m., the 727 descended toward Reno, under instructions relayed by the tower. The landing lights pierced the storm in shallow cones. The aircraft touched down gently, its tires hissing across the wet surface. When it rolled to a stop, emergency vehicles surrounded it at distance. Agents in raincoats approached carefully, their flashlights bobbing through mist. The rear stairs still hung open, slick with rain. No figure waited there. Only a smear of moisture glistened across the lower steps, indistinct in the glare of lights. Inside, the cabin showed evidence of absence: an empty seat, a cut parachute cord, a tie pinned to the tray, the bourbon glass still half filled with melted ice. The air carried the smell of smoke and metal. The agents boarded methodically, photographing each detail. They bagged the tie, the cigarette butts, the glass, and several fingerprints lifted from armrests and surfaces. None were clear enough to identify. Every item was logged and sealed in paper evidence, envelopes marked with the code NORJAC 71 to 305. By midnight, the aircraft stood empty, under hangar lights. The crew gave initial debriefings, their faces pale from exhaustion. The investigators spread maps across a table, marking potential jump zones along the route south of Seattle. Weather data from the U.S. Weather Bureau indicated winds from the southeast at high speed, shifting erratically between 50 and 80 miles per hour. The coordinates of Ariel, Washington, emerged as the most probable descent corridor. Helicopters launched before dawn, their spotlights slicing across timbered valleys and river bends. They found nothing. No torn canopy, no footprints, no trace of human landing. Search teams trekked through mud and cedar groves, their radios crackling against the storm static. The wilderness gave them silence. At sunrise, the first official reports reached Washington, D.C. The headline in Seattle's morning paper already carried the story: Air pirate escapes by parachute with $200,000. The legend had begun before the evidence cooled. The name D.B. Cooper would follow within days, born from a clerical mishearing that history would never correct. For the men who had flown the plane, the noise of that night never left. The hum of engines, the roar of open air, the sudden lightness that signaled his departure. For the investigators, it marked the start of a pursuit that would span generations. For the world beyond the storm, it became a story about the moment a man stepped out of an aircraft and into myth. Morning broke over the Pacific Northwest in a dull wash of pewter light. Clouds hung low, heavy and unmoving, the air still thick with the remnants of the night's storm. In the damp hangars of Reno, Tahoe Airport, the Boeing 727 stood silent under a canopy of halogen glare. Its skin was streaked with rainwater, its stairway still extended. The last trace of a man who had vanished into the sky. Agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation moved around the aircraft with clipboard precision, photographing every surface, measuring every distance, collecting the small, stubborn details that might yield direction. Each cigarette butt, each fingerprint smear, each hair fiber went into a separate envelope. The tie, narrow, black, clipped neatly to the tray, was sealed and tagged. The bourbon glass, the instruction notes, the paper scraps were cataloged by time and position. The cabin smelled faintly of cold metal and stale smoke, a chemical echo of the tension that had lived there only hours before. At dawn, a command post formed in a rented conference room inside Seattle's field office. Jack, Northwest Hijacking, was written across the top of the first case sheet in heavy marker. Maps of Washington and Oregon were pinned to the walls, overlaid with transparent flight charts and weather data. A red grease pencil traced the Boeing's path from its holding pattern north of Seattle through its southbound course over the Lewis River Valley. Meteorological tables were consulted, wind vectors recalculated, altitudes compared. Analysts from McCord Air Force Base cross-referenced radar plots from 8 p.m. to 8:30 p.m., noting the minute dip at 8:11, the point when the aircraft had jolted upward and the man had stepped into darkness. That single blip became the heart of every search grid drawn that week. Helicopters launched within hours, their rotors beating fog into rings over the Cowlitz and Clark County forests. Below, sheriff's deputies and volunteers pushed through wet underbrush, guided by compass bearings and two-way radio. The terrain fought back. Cedar trunks the width of barrels, slopes slick with moss, ravines filled with runoff. Each yard demanded effort. The storm had erased whatever faint tracks might have existed. The ground was saturated. Footprints dissolved within minutes. Teams carried color aerial photographs, scanning for irregularities. A torn canopy, a drag mark, a disturbance in tree crowns. Nothing emerged but endless green and mud. Back in Seattle, evidence technicians examined the bills delivered as ransom. Each serial number had been recorded before transfer. A full ledger now stored in vaults for reference. Photostats of the list were distributed to banks across the United States, and later to international law enforcement networks. Any appearance of those numbers would trigger immediate alert. The money became both proof and bait. Forensic specialists tested the tie under microscopes, searching for latent prints. They lifted partial ridges too smudged for comparison. Fibers revealed synthetic blends common to department store clothing of the era. JCPenney, confirmed by label remnants. The result gave the hijacker shape, but no identity. A man of modest means with precise taste, not luxury. In the days that followed, more than 800 suspects were flagged. Ex-military parachutists, airline employees, missing persons, even ex-convicts recently paroled, were cross-checked against descriptions from the crew. Each interview produced new names. Each name led to a dead end. Agents drafted composite sketches based on the flight attendant's memories. Mid-40s, average build, dark hair combed straight back, brown eyes, no visible scars or accent. The face looked ordinary, the kind that could blend into any terminal or street. Newspapers printed it across the nation beneath the wrong initials. A reporter's misunderstanding of a background check on 1DB. Cooper, unconnected to the crime, replaced Dan overnight. By morning, the error was permanent. The investigation searched for Dan Cooper. The public myth pursued DB Cooper. The FBI's daily briefings grew tense. Aerial sweeps covered hundreds of square miles between the Lewis and Columbia rivers. The Air Force's C-130 units flew grid patterns, using infrared sensors. Ground parties camped in the rain, combing valleys one coordinate at a time. They found the remains of deer, abandoned logging gear, fragments of parachute material later proven unrelated. The wilderness yielded nothing human. Analysts considered the probability that Cooper had not survived, that his parachute failed, or that he had struck one of the countless firs standing like spears below. Yet no body, no torn fabric, no money appeared. Absence became the first real clue. At headquarters, Director J. Edgar Hoover's staff demanded updates. The Bureau issued circulars, summarizing the case, the hijacker's method, his demands, his apparent knowledge of aircraft operation. Field offices nationwide were instructed to monitor for men suddenly in possession of large amounts of $20 bills. Agents checked casinos, racetracks, car dealerships, and banks. No suspicious deposits surfaced. The $200,000, each bill individually marked, simply vanished from circulation. Winter settled over the Cascades, ending the first phase of the search. Snow-buried valleys and logging roads, sealing whatever evidence lay beneath. Helicopters grounded. The investigation shifted from recovery to analysis. Technicians reconstructed the plane's interior in a hangar, testing the stair mechanism under various weights and speeds to replicate the jump. They confirmed that a person could exit safely, but not easily. The airflow created violent turbulence at the stair base. To leap from that height in loafers and a business suit bordered on suicide. Yet the man had done it, and perhaps survived. By early 1972, Norjack filled entire filing cabinets. Agents mapped every plausible landing site, from Lake Merwin to Mount St. Helens. Diving teams scoured the Columbia's banks where currents might have carried debris. Nothing surfaced. Skeptics within the Bureau began calling the suspect a phantom. Others insisted he must have perished instantly. The absence of ransom circulation, they argued, proved death. But without proof, the case remained open, suspended between certainty and myth. Then came the imitators. Within months, several copycat hijackings occurred, each demanding cash and parachutes, each ending in arrest. Among them was Richard Floyd McCoy, a former Green Beret who leapt from a United Airlines flight in Utah, with half the method but none of the disappearance. His capture fueled speculation that he and Cooper were the same man. Physical differences and handwriting samples later ruled him out, but his case showed how the legend had already outpaced fact. Back in Washington, spring melted the snows, and search parties resumed with renewed determination. They found animal bones, rusted cans, tire tracks, nothing more. The Bureau's log for July 1972 recorded the search officially inconclusive. Cooper's file remained active, but field resources moved on to newer crimes. The hijacking lived now in folders, photographs, and the uneasy fascination of those who had chased shadows across 600 square miles of forest. The plane, cleaned and refitted, returned quietly to service under a new registration number. Passengers who boarded it in later years never knew they walked the same aisle once occupied by a man who had stepped from its tail into oblivion. In time, the story grew beyond the Bureau's control. Magazine profiles painted Cooper as a modern outlaw, calm and gentlemanly, a thief who harmed no one and beat the system. Radio hosts speculated nightly, blending verified facts with imagination, until the distinction blurred. For the FBI, the case had become both a failure of capture and a study in human fascination. Each unanswered question drew more attention than any solved crime could. Inside the Seattle field office, a single corkboard carried a weathered photograph of the sketch, pinned above the word open. Below it hung the flight map, marked by a red dot at 8:11 p.m., the only fixed moment in a story otherwise erased by wind and time. Every new agent studied it during orientation. Every veteran passed it on. The mystery of D.B. Cooper had entered the Bureau's own folklore, a reminder that even in an age of fingerprints and radar, a man could still disappear completely. Outside, the forests reclaimed themselves. Moss-covered footprints, long dissolved. Branches straightened where helicopters once hovered. Rivers swelled and receded. Whatever truth had fallen from the sky that November night lay buried under years of rain. But the legend remained above ground, growing, mutating, refusing to fade. By the mid-1970s, Norjack had become less a manhunt than a vast archive. Dozens of file cabinets in the Seattle field office held photographs, witness statements, bank ledgers, and forensic reports bound with rubber bands that had long turned brittle. Agents rotated in and out, each generation inheriting the same mystery, a hijacker with no origin and no afterimage. The walls of the Bureau's conference room were still lined with maps from the first search, edges curling, red circles fading, where investigators once thought they were close. The case that began in the roar of a storm now lived in the hush of paperwork. Every new agent started the same way, by reviewing the suspect list that never stopped changing. More than 800 names had been examined, from missing pilots to drifters, found dead in distant counties. Each had been compared against the composite sketch, drawn from the memories of 2 flight attendants. None matched precisely. The closest resembled the man, only in posture or manner. As the years passed, the image of D.B. Cooper shifted from a face to an idea. One of the earliest serious candidates was Richard Floyd McCoy, a decorated Vietnam veteran and recreational skydiver, who in 1972 commandeered a United Airlines jet from Denver and escaped by parachute with $500,000. His method mirrored Cooper's, but he was captured within days. When agents interviewed him in prison, his denial was firm. His knowledge of Cooper's case, drawn entirely from newspaper clippings. Physical comparison ruled him out. Different facial structure, different voice, a decade younger. McCoy remained the Bureau's favorite suspect to outsiders, but internally, he was discarded by year's end. Then came Dwayne Weber, a quiet Florida man who allegedly confessed on his deathbed in 1995 that he had been D.B. Cooper. His widow contacted the FBI, delivering a box of notebooks, photographs, and fragments of military gear. Handwriting analysts compared his notes to Cooper's letters. The curves and slants bore superficial resemblance, but failed forensic standards. DNA collected from his personal effects did not match the partial sample preserved on Cooper's tie. Weber's file thickened with interviews and ended in silence, another story absorbed by the myth it tried to claim. The 1970s produced others: Sheridan Peterson, a Boeing employee, and Smoke Jumper, who fit the physical type, but had been abroad during the hijacking. Kenneth Christensen, a Northwest Orient purser, whose financial habits changed after 1971. William Gossett, a military instructor who spoke often of secret operations in the Cascades. Each suspect brought a surge of media attention, followed by a collapse under evidence. Every name yielded an echo of possibility, then returned to the archive. Forensics evolved, but progress remained theoretical. The ransom money, its serial numbers logged in endless ledgers, never reappeared in circulation. Periodic sweeps of bank deposits produced nothing. The Bureau even issued public pleas through television broadcasts. Any $20 bill beginning with L Series 9 to be reported immediately. Decades passed without a single match. It was as if the bills had evaporated with the man who carried them. The tie remained the central artifact. In the late 1970s, it was re-examined under improved microscopes. Analysts found minute metallic fragments embedded in the fibers: titanium, aluminum, rare alloys used in aircraft manufacturing and chemical facilities. The discovery suggested Cooper might have worked in an industrial environment. The lead opened a narrow path, cross-checking employees at titanium plants and aerospace contractors across the Pacific Northwest. The list was long, the overlap vast. Hundreds of personnel files were compared, none aligned with the hijackers, age, build, and disappearance pattern. Public fascination deepened. As Bureau frustration grew, journalists filled the vacuum with speculation that Cooper had been an airline insider, an ex-pilot seeking revenge, a veteran lost between wars. Television reenactments dramatized his composure, transforming the crime into a symbol of daring independence. For investigators, each dramatization complicated truth, blending witness testimony with fiction, until neither could be untangled. The more famous he became, the less real he seemed. By 1980, Jack had entered its 9th year without closure. The case file exceeded 60 volumes. Then a small miracle surfaced from the silt of the Columbia River. A boy digging a sandbank on Tana Bar, near Vancouver, Washington, uncovered rotting bundles of $20 bills bound with rubber bands fused by time. The serial numbers matched the Cooper ransom exactly. $5,800 in total. The find reignited every dormant theory. Divers swept the riverbed. Geologists studied sediment layers to estimate how long the money had been buried. The results only added confusion. The bills lay several inches below a layer of ash. Deposited after dredging in 1974, implying they had not been there since 1971. Whether they had washed downstream or been planted later could not be proven. The find confirmed the money had reached the ground, but not the man. The discovery launched another round of suspects and searches. Teams revisited the Lewis River zone, mapping drift patterns and erosion lines. Nothing else surfaced. The partial recovery served as proof of both presence and absence. The ransom had touched Earth, but the rest remained missing. Through the 1980s, Jack became a legacy assignment for senior agents nearing retirement. The FBI's budget shifted to new priorities: terrorism, organized crime, digital forensics. The Cooper file persisted only because no one could justify closing it. Each new regional director reviewed the evidence, made minor notes, then signed the same conclusion: investigation continuing. Subject unidentified. By the 1990s, technology offered renewed hope. The Bureau digitized its fingerprint archives and rechecked the smudged prints from the 727 cabin. None produced a match. DNA testing began in the late decade. A minute sample recovered from the tie yielded a partial profile. It excluded several suspects, but confirmed nothing new. The physical trail had decayed to molecules, the investigative trail to memory. Still, the myth endured. Amateur sleuths published books, each claiming the final answer. Conferences formed, documentaries aired. The FBI monitored them from a distance, quietly verifying each new claim against the evidence log. No revelation survived comparison with fact. In 2007, the Bureau issued a controlled release of case materials to encourage public tips. Thousands of emails arrived. None altered the narrative. Inside the Bureau's evidence vault, the artifacts remain preserved. The tie, the parachute remnants, the envelope of money from Tana Bar. Their silence said more than analysis ever could. Each object represented a fixed point in a story otherwise fluid, the tangible residue of an event that refused conclusion. The investigators who had started in 1971 retired one by one, their successors inheriting a legend rather than a lead. What remained constant was the timeline on the office wall: 2:57 p.m., ticket purchase; 3:02 p.m., takeoff; 5:45 p.m., landing; 8:11 p.m., jump. 4 hours that defined 50 years of pursuit. The precision of those numbers mocked every failure that followed. By the time the century turned, the case had passed from investigation to history, living not in the field, but in the archive. A story locked behind metal drawers, and the persistent glow of fascination outside the Bureau's walls. Yet the name, born of error, continued to echo through every new decade. D.B. Cooper, the man who vanished between two breaths of wind. 9 years after the night sky closed over the Boeing 727, the Columbia River ran slow and wide through its winter course. The surrounding land was bare, the color of ash and silt, with the faint smell of salt and wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys. On an overcast afternoon in February 1980, a family from Vancouver, Washington, set up camp along a stretch of sand known as Tena Bar, where the river bent gently toward the Pacific. A boy wandered ahead, shovel in hand, turning over wet sand. As the current hissed softly beside him, his shovel struck something dense, and when he cleared away the grit, paper fragments emerged, edges darkened by rot, bound together by decaying rubber bands. He lifted one, then another, and called out. Beneath the top layer lay hundreds more, stacked in clusters of $20 bills. The discovery moved quickly from curiosity to revelation. Local police marked off the site. FBI agents arrived within hours. The sandbank became a field laboratory, under gray light and river mist. Cameras clicked in sequence. The bills were lifted carefully, each bundle placed in plastic evidence sleeves. When the serial numbers were cross-checked that night, they matched exactly, line for line, with the list issued in November 1971 for the D.B. Cooper ransom, $5,800, in total still wrapped in the same bank bands, now brittle and fused. For the first time in nearly a decade, the case had produced something real, something that had touched the same air as the man himself. The news spread through the bureau like static. For agents who had long filed Cooper under legend, the river money was proof that at least part of the story had ended on Earth. Yet it raised more questions than it answered. If the money had been buried by the river, had Cooper survived to hide it, or had it washed downstream from a crash site somewhere in the mountains? Geologists and hydrologists were summoned to map possibilities. Core samples of sand revealed distinct layers. The top, deposited by the seasonal floods of 1979. Below it, a layer of volcanic ash from dredging operations in 1974. Beneath that, the compacted strata where the bills had rested. If the money lay beneath the 1974 layer, it could not have been deposited in 1971. The data implied later movement. Perhaps river erosion. Perhaps human placement. No certainty followed. Investigators combed the shoreline for miles, sifting silt and gravel, marking coordinates with stakes. Nothing else appeared. Only the recovered bundles remained. Edges softened by water. Ink faded but legible. Laboratory analysis confirmed the decay consistent with long submersion, but not necessarily with time spent in the open. The mystery deepened. The money existed, but its path was unknowable. The Bureau reopened old files. Teams revisited the Lewis River in Ariel, Washington, drawing new grids that followed possible river flows into the Columbia. Helicopters retraced the 1971 flight path with advanced sensors, searching for metal fragments or debris. They found none. Whatever had fallen from the sky had either been claimed by the river or buried beneath layers of forest growth, now nearly a decade old. Media attention reignited. Cameras crowded the banks of Tena Bar, reporters standing knee-deep in mud, while helicopters circled overhead. The image of the bills, photographed and printed in newspapers across the country, revived the myth for a new generation. The public fascination that had dimmed now burned again. The boy who found the money became a temporary symbol. The child who uncovered the ghost of D.B. Cooper. Inside the FBI, the reaction was less romantic. Technicians measured every band, every alignment of the bills. They discovered the bundles were in the same order they had been issued. Serial numbers consecutive, still grouped in the pattern of packaging from the bank. That meant they had not been scattered by explosion or long-term exposure. They had stayed together, bound by the same rubber that had preserved their structure for 9 years. The question turned to geography. How had they traveled 20 miles from the estimated jump zone to this quiet river bend without disintegration? Specialists built scale models of the Columbia's currents, simulating drift patterns under varying floods. The results contradicted each other. The river was too complex, its path too mutable to fix a single origin. The forensic hope that the find might solve the case gave way to the realization that it had only widened it. The theory of survival, once dismissed, returned to the table. Could Cooper have landed near the river, buried part of the money, and disappeared again? Agents considered the logistics. He had no vehicle, no known accomplice, no winter gear. The weather that night had been near freezing, the terrain unforgiving, yet the possibility persisted, because the evidence refused to deny it. In March 1980, the bills were cleaned, flattened, and stored in climate-controlled containers. A portion of the find was later returned to the boy's family, under legal guidelines for recovered property. The rest entered the FBI's evidence archive, sealed with new catalog numbers. Photographs of the waterlogged bills joined the rows of black and white images in the Norjack files, the first tangible addition in nearly a decade. The renewed publicity brought a surge of claims. Letters arrived daily from self-identified witnesses, relatives, and opportunists. Some insisted Cooper had died in the jump, and that they knew where. Others claimed to have been his neighbor, his friend, or his confessor. Each lead added a paragraph to the growing stack of paperwork that led nowhere. The Bureau followed them all, because procedure demanded it. Each trail ended the same way, speculation dissolving into myth. The geological analysis of the Tenabar site concluded in late 1980 with a final report. The most likely explanation was redeposition. The money had once been buried upstream, and later unearthed by flooding, before settling again in the sand. The time of its arrival could not be fixed, only narrowed to a window between 1974 and 1979. For the Bureau, the report was closure, without conclusion. The evidence confirmed only that the money had touched Earth, long after the man himself had vanished. The following year, Norjack entered a new phase. The active search for Cooper's body was declared suspended, replaced by long-term monitoring. Fieldwork gave way to analysis. The FBI's laboratory preserved the Tenabar samples as benchmarks for any future discovery. The agents who had begun the case in 1971 were nearing retirement, their replacements treating Cooper as inherited folklore, rather than ongoing pursuit. The myth had become institutional memory, yet the river continued to yield hints of its own timeline. In 1981, children found another small fragment of Bill near the same sandbank, though the serial number proved unrelated. Each rumor of new evidence sent brief ripples through the Bureau, quickly silenced by confirmation. By the mid-1980s, the Columbia had returned to silence, its currents erasing footprints faster than any search could trace them. Still, the Tenabar discovery changed the psychology of the case. It proved that some fragment of Cooper's plan had succeeded. The ransom had reached the ground, intact. Whether by accident, current, or design, it had survived where everything else had not. To the FBI, it was the first evidence of completion, even if partial, even if meaningless in isolation. To the public, it was resurrection. The myth, dormant for a decade, lived again. By the decade's end, the Bureau's official report listed the Tenabar money as recovered artifact A. It was photographed under controlled lighting, each bill numbered and sealed in transparent film. Those images would become the enduring symbol of the case, a decayed currency bundle that carried the weight of every unanswered question. Outside the Bureau, television specials revisited the story. Books speculated on new theories. Each retelling ended with the same image: the boy's hands lifting those wet bundles from the sand, sunlight cutting through the clouds for a moment, glinting across waterlogged ink. It was the single frame of the mystery that time refused to erase, proof that something of D.B. Cooper had touched the world again before vanishing forever. By the mid-1980s, Norjack had drifted from investigation to endurance. The FBI's files no longer expanded by discovery, but by repetition. Agents transferred in and out, adding new summaries to old evidence, retyping reports already written a dozen times before. The case had aged into a ritual, a reminder that procedure, however perfect, could not compel truth from silence. But outside the Bureau, the story refused to rest. The name D.B. Cooper had outgrown its case number and entered American mythology. Newspaper columns, late-night talk shows, and paperback thrillers reshaped the hijacker into a symbol of defiance. The man who vanished cleanly, without cruelty, leaving only imagination behind. His image was printed on t-shirts and beer labels, his story retold in bars along the Pacific coast, as if it were local folklore. Every generation found in him what it wanted to see: courage, greed, rebellion, escape. For the Bureau, the noise was an inconvenience. For the public, it was freedom from conclusion. Television reenactments staged the hijacking with cinematic calm, the actor in dark suit and sunglasses descending the aft stairs into a storm of artificial rain. Each portrayal hardened the myth and blurred the man. In these retellings, Cooper survived. He always landed safely, always vanished into a life rebuilt under another name. The reality, the likelihood of a fatal fall into wilderness, was too cold to keep the story alive. Myth required endurance. Death offered only an ending. Inside the FBI, senior analysts reviewed the cultural fascination with clinical detachment. They noted how public interest surged every 5 years, usually around anniversaries. Each surge produced new self-appointed investigators, retired engineers and hobbyist detectives, who mailed the Bureau thick envelopes of theories. They mapped flight trajectories on kitchen tables, matched handwriting from marriage licenses, and built homemade replicas of the Boeing stairway. The Bureau cataloged these submissions under public correspondence, their pages stacked into cardboard boxes that filled an auxiliary storeroom. By 1990, thousands of pages of speculation, each one carefully logged before being forgotten. Some theories carried fragments of logic. One former paratrooper proposed that Cooper had misjudged the wind drift and landed in the Washougal River basin, an area overlooked in early searches. Another argued that he had lost his parachute during descent and drowned before dawn. Yet every plausible claim was balanced by something improbable. Reports of men boasting in bars, of strangers flashing old $20 bills, of confessions made under the influence of failing memory. The Bureau investigated each one out of duty. None held. The discovery at Tenna Bar had, paradoxically, weakened the case's focus. It had proved the ransom existed, but dissolved the certainty of its location. After 1980, the geographical center of the investigation stretched from the Cascades to the Columbia Delta. The area was too vast, the evidence too small. Aerial photographs and hydrological models could not resurrect the moment of the jump. Each calculation returned to the same uncertainty. A single blip on radar, a single flash of light on instruments at 8:11 p.m., and then absence. By the early 1990s, forensic science had changed. The FBI introduced DNA sequencing, digitized fingerprints, and computerized suspect databases. The Norjack file was revisited with cautious hope. The tie, still sealed in its envelope, its fibers untouched since 1971, was reopened under sterile glass. Technicians extracted a minute sample of biological residue from the inner collar band. Skin flakes, sweat traces, faint but present. The analysis produced a partial genetic profile, incomplete yet viable for comparison. Over the next decade, every major suspect was tested against that sequence. None matched. The tie, like the myth, remained alone. Public fascination only grew. Authors published books claiming final answers. Cooper as a retired CIA operative, a failed gambler, a small-town teacher who vanished to Canada. Each release reignited interest. Each ended in contradiction. The case became less about identity and more about endurance. How long a story could persist without conclusion before it ceased to be a case at all. Within the Bureau, Norjack's custodianship passed to a small rotation of agents. They reviewed tips weekly, maintained chain of custody on artifacts, and issued occasional press statements, confirming the investigation's ongoing status. Their tone was measured, their optimism procedural. None expected resolution. To close the case would have meant admitting defeat, yet to pursue it promised nothing. It remained open because closure felt dishonest. Outside, the legend settled into Americana. Parachuting enthusiasts held annual gatherings near Ariel, Washington, raising glasses to a man they called the last outlaw. Tourist shops sold mock ransom notes and imitation ties. Reporters returned each Thanksgiving, standing before the gray woods and repeating the same line, that somewhere beyond the horizon, a man had jumped into history and never come down. Within the archives of the Bureau, reality was quieter. The binders grew brittle. Photographs faded to sepia. The names of the original investigators were penciled on the backs of pages already yellowed at the edges. Time moved forward, while the case stood still. The coordinates on the old maps meant less with each year. Rivers changed course. Forestry grew over logging cuts. Even the people who once lived near the suspected landing zone aged out of memory. Witnesses died. Records were lost to office closures and floods. What remained was paper and the discipline of preservation. By 1995, Norjack was the longest open hijacking investigation in the Bureau's history. New directors reviewed it out of respect, not hope. The tie, the money, and the recovered parachute fragments had become museum pieces stored in climate control beneath layers of bureaucracy. Technicians performed routine condition checks, noting temperature and humidity on log sheets that would one day be archived themselves. The case had entered stasis, an investigation without motion, sustained only by the gravity of its own legend. The cultural weight surrounding D.B. Cooper had by then detached from the real man entirely. To the public, he represented an ideal, an invisible thief who had humiliated authority without violence and disappeared untouched. In bars and documentaries, he was not a criminal, but an apparition of freedom. The Bureau saw him differently, not as myth but as absence, a gap in the record that precision could not close. The more exact the data, the wider the void became. Some nights, younger agents assigned to evidence duty would unseal the cabinet labeled a Norjack and study the artifacts in silence. The tie, pressed flat against archival paper, still held the faint shimmer of metal dust under its weave. The bills from Tenna Bar, discolored and crumbling, retained their serial sequence, like the steady heartbeat of a story long dead. Between them lay nothing, no fingerprint clear enough to name, no face that could be proven, only the trace of a man who had stepped from an aircraft into eternity. By the late 1990s, the case no longer belonged to law enforcement. It belonged to time. The Bureau maintained it as an obligation. The public carried it as folklore. What had begun as a search for a hijacker had become a mirror reflecting the country's fascination with possibility. That in a world measured by surveillance and systems, one man had once escaped both gravity and record. The story had outlived the facts, and the myth had outlasted the investigation. But still, in a locked cabinet under the flicker of fluorescent light, the label remained the same. Norjack. Open. The morning of November 24, 1971. began in a wash of gray light. Across the Pacific Northwest, Portland was still wet from an overnight drizzle, the streets reflecting blurred halos from traffic lights and neon signs. Thanksgiving sat on the horizon, and travelers moved through the city in waves, coats buttoned, luggage rolling, conversation soft. By early afternoon, the rain had settled into a thin mist, clinging to glass and asphalt like a film. Inside Portland International Airport, the air smelled of jet fuel, tobacco, and polished floors. Loudspeakers carried the rhythm of boarding calls and distant static, layered over the echo of footsteps and suitcase wheels. Travelers queued at counters beneath the fluorescent hum. It was an ordinary Wednesday, unremarkable in every sense, until a man stepped through the main doors, carrying a small black attaché. He paused under the terminal clock, checked the time, and adjusted the cuff of his shirt with unhurried precision. He looked like any mid-level businessman, passing through the Pacific Corridor. A man neither remarkable nor forgettable. His suit was dark and neatly pressed, tailored but modest. A white shirt framed his tie, black and narrow, the knot pulled tight against his throat. His hair was combed straight back, brown with traces of gray, catching the artificial light. A faint shadow of stubble traced his jaw, clean but not meticulous. He moved with measured confidence, his shoes clicking against the tiles as if every step was rehearsed. At the Northwest Orient Airlines counter, he stood behind a family and waited without expression. When his turn came, he placed a $20 bill on the counter and asked for a one-way ticket to Seattle. Flight 3. The transaction lasted seconds. The clerk later remembered his politeness, his steady posture, and the way he tucked the ticket stub neatly into his inside jacket pocket before turning away. He didn't rush, didn't hesitate, and didn't check his surroundings. He crossed the concourse to the bar, the smell of whiskey heavy in the air. He ordered a drink, sat for a few minutes, and watched planes through the glass. Rain streaked across the windows in long diagonal trails. The announcer's voice echoed overhead. Final call for several afternoon departures. When he finished his drink, he placed a few bills on the counter, stood, and collected his attaché. No one noticed him leave. Security in 1971 was a formality. There were no scanners, no bag checks, no identification verification beyond a ticket stub. He walked directly through the gate corridor, with the same calm precision he had carried since entering the building. His boarding pass was punched, without pause. To the gate agent, he was one of 40 passengers headed north, a businessman, catching a short flight before the holiday. As he stepped into the Boeing 727, the hum of the engines filled the narrow cabin. The air inside was dense with cigarette smoke, and the smell of synthetic upholstery. Laughter and conversation floated softly between rows. He scanned the cabin with a slow, deliberate glance, then moved down the aisle until he reached row 18, near the rear, close to the aft staircase that opened directly from the tail, a feature known to few outside of aviation. He stowed his attaché carefully on the floor beside him and settled into the aisle seat. From this vantage, he could see the entire cabin reflected in the overhead compartments. Faces, gestures, light. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, performing pre-flight checks, their smiles mechanical but steady. He sat motionless, his hands folded loosely in his lap. The cabin noise rose and fell around him, the sound of safety belts clicking and newspapers rustling. Outside, the light dimmed as a low front drifted across the sky. The rain intensified, pattering against the fuselage. The man leaned slightly, adjusting the air vent above his seat, then drew from his jacket pocket a small pack of Raleigh cigarettes. He lit one with a match, exhaled a controlled stream of smoke, and rested the cigarette in the ashtray built into the armrest. He looked neither anxious nor distracted, only composed, as if this quiet anonymity suited him. The captain's voice echoed faintly from the intercom, announcing taxi clearance. The aircraft trembled as it pushed back from the gate, the engines deepening into a low, resonant growl. The man reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a slip of paper, a ticket stub folded around another smaller piece of stationery. He checked it briefly, then replaced it, every movement deliberate, unhurried. The flight attendant approached to take beverage requests before takeoff, her steps balanced against the slight sway of the taxi. He requested a bourbon and soda. When she returned, he accepted it with a nod, lifted it once to his lips, and set it down on the tray. The ice clinked faintly as the aircraft turned onto the runway. Beyond the window, the runway lights glowed through streaks of water. The engines roared as the aircraft began its acceleration, the vibration humming through the metal floor beneath his shoes. The rain outside blurred into white lines of motion. As the 727 lifted from the ground, he closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, but in silent acknowledgement, like a ritual marking the beginning of something long planned. Below, the city dissolved into fog and distance. The river wound through it like a gray vein. The aircraft climbed into the overcast, swallowed by clouds, the light dimming to near twilight inside the cabin. Seatbelt signs glowed red above rows of indifferent travelers. The man reopened his eyes, steady, expressionless, and watched the seatbelt light flicker faintly in reflection across his glass. The engines leveled, the shudder of ascent smoothing into the hum of steady flight. The man in seat 18E reached for the attaché beside his feet, adjusting its position by inches until it rested directly against his right leg. The flight had just begun. But everything that would follow, the ransom, the descent, the mystery that would outlive the century, already existed in his calm, controlled stillness. The other passengers leaned back into routine, magazines unfolded, ice clinking, laughter subdued. The cabin carried the faint electric scent of ozone, as the aircraft pierced through a cold front. Outside the window the world was nothing but white. The man's reflection hovered faintly in the glass, unblinking, detached, and perfectly still. He lifted his glass again, finished the bourbon in 2 slow movements, and looked once more toward the aisle. His expression betrayed no thought, no anticipation, only patience. The aircraft adjusted course slightly, nose dipping through the upper turbulence. The pilot's instruments read steady, 10,000 feet, heading north-northeast. Behind the curtain near the galley, the attendants exchanged quiet signals of routine preparation. From his seat, the man in the dark suit watched the movement, memorizing patterns, where they walked, how they turned when they paused between rows. He glanced toward the overhead panel, watching the faint flicker of lights that marked cabin functions. Then, almost imperceptibly, he reached for the folded slip of paper in his jacket pocket once more, and set it on the tray. His left hand rested lightly over it, fingertips steady against the surface. The faint vibration of the engines trembled beneath his touch. The note was already written. The aircraft continued north through the fading daylight, unaware that the routine of this short 40-minute flight was minutes away from becoming the most enduring unsolved crime in American history. As the clouds thickened outside, he adjusted his seatbelt, reached for the empty glass, and set it neatly aside. His gaze never left the aisle ahead. Every second of the quiet that filled that cabin, the muted hum, the gentle clatter of trays, the mechanical steadiness of flight, was part of the calm before the unraveling. Flight 305 was 20 minutes into its journey, when the man in seat 18E finally shifted his posture, straightened his jacket, and prepared to alter history. When the FBI closed Norjack in 2016, the physical investigation ended. But the story did not. Outside the vaults, the case breathed through others, historians, hobbyists, writers, and voices that refused the silence of bureaucracy. What had begun as an act of crime had over decades transformed into folklore, a seamless blend of fact, speculation, and national imagination. In the Pacific Northwest, the forests once scoured by helicopters grew dense again. Saplings planted after the searches now rose high enough to erase their own history. The old flight path existed only on maps printed in books or displayed in documentaries. Yet each November, the skies above Ariel, Washington, still filled with skydivers. They leapt from aircraft into the same cold air, where Cooper vanished, their chutes opening like white blooms against gray. Crowds gathered on the ground, raising drinks and applause toward the descending figures. The ritual was half celebration, half seance, a human tribute to an unsolved question. Television rediscovered him repeatedly. Every new decade produced its definitive account. Dramatizations narrated in solemn tones, showing the same sequence: the quiet man at the counter, the bourbon in his hand, the note passed across the aisle, the storm swallowing the plane. Actors portrayed him with the same stillness, the same measured calm that the attendants had described. Each reenactment ended with that final image: the staircase open, the rain sweeping in, and a figure stepping into blackness. There was never a landing, never a body, never an afterward. The myth remained frozen at the edge of the door, forever falling, never touching ground. In print, the theories multiplied until they became a genre of their own. Dozens of authors offered answers, each claiming to reveal the true identity of D.B. Cooper. He was said to be a retired pilot from Spokane, a con man from Oregon, a paratrooper from North Carolina, a Canadian comic book fan, inspired by a fictional Dan Cooper. The contradiction among them became part of the legend, proof that the mystery had no owner, only inheritors. Every theory mirrored the decade that produced it. In the 70s, Cooper was an outlaw, against authority. In the 80s, he was a trickster who escaped the system. By the 21st century, he was nostalgia, a symbol of a time when disappearance was still possible. The media's language changed too. He was no longer called a hijacker, but a folk hero. The tone softened with each retelling, until the crime seemed secondary to its audacity. He became shorthand for anonymity, invoked in movies, songs, and advertising campaigns. Musicians named albums after him. Novelists borrowed his mystique. He lived less as a man than as a metaphor, proof that in an age of surveillance and conformity, someone had once walked away untouched. Academics studied the phenomenon, calling it a uniquely American myth, the fusion of rebellion, mystery, and performance. Unlike the outlaws of the 19th century, Cooper left no violence behind. He stole money from a corporation, hurt no one, and vanished without spectacle. His restraint elevated him. His silence preserved him. The country, restless with its own contradictions, found comfort in him. He represented the fantasy of control, calm in chaos, precise under pressure, free in the end. For the Bureau, the case had become a legacy, rather than a failure. When questioned in interviews, former agents spoke without regret. They described the investigation as a mirror of its time, an era before databases and digital footprints, when a single decision could still erase a man. They preserved the story as a lesson in humility, that even perfect systems have limits, that sometimes the unknown survives. The closure of Norjak marked not defeat, but transition, the recognition that the mystery now belonged to history, not enforcement. In museums, the artifacts drew quiet reverence. At the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., the tie lay under glass, its narrow fabric resting beside magnified images of the titanium particles embedded within. The recovered 10-bar bills sat nearby, darkened and brittle, their numbers faded but visible. Visitors leaned close to the display, searching for meaning in the evidence, as though proximity might reveal what investigation could not. Each object radiated the same quiet gravity, proof of existence, denial of conclusion. They were fragments of a story whose center had been lost to air. Online, the mythology expanded into endless forums, digital descendants of the old search parties. Users debated minute details, wind velocity, flight angle, the probability of survival, given Cooper's chosen parachute. They posted satellite images, terrain overlays, equations. Some built computer simulations of the fall, frame by frame, trying to catch the invisible moment between life and disappearance. No consensus ever emerged. Every analysis ended where it began, with a man standing on a stair, a storm below, and a question hanging in midair. In time, the narrative took on the rhythm of ritual. Each Thanksgiving, articles revisited the case, headlines repeating the same pattern: the unsolved hijacking, the FBI's closure, the enduring fascination. It became a calendar event, a cultural echo marking the arrival of the holiday season. While the country gathered around tables, television anchors revisited the flight that never landed. The man in the dark suit had become a seasonal ghost, not mourned, not feared, simply remembered. Half a century after the hijacking, the Pacific Northwest remained the same kind of place he had left behind. The same gray skies, the same cold rivers, the same thin line between civilization and wilderness. The forests that had once swallowed him now carried roads and homes, but their silence remained unchanged. Hikers, passing through valleys north of Portland, sometimes imagined him still there, a shadow among trees, a phantom in the fog. No one believed it, but the thought persisted. It was the comfort of unresolved stories, the idea that something could remain beyond reach. For the culture that adopted him, Cooper became a paradox, both real and unreal, both human and myth. His precision, his composure, his disappearance, all felt cinematic, as if he had written himself out of history on purpose. The line between fact and fiction had blurred beyond recognition. The truth mattered less than the endurance of the story itself. When historians write about the case now, they note how it mirrors the 20th century's faith in mystery. It began in an analog world of typewriters and paper tickets, survived the rise of satellites, and entered the digital age untouched. It belonged to no single era because it existed between them, a hinge, connecting the simplicity of the past to the complexity of the present. In the end, D.B. Cooper stood not for crime, but for possibility. He was the last man to vanish completely, not because he escaped justice, but because he escaped definition. And so the story remains, suspended like the man himself, forever mid-air, forever between light and dark, forever descending through rain toward a landscape no one ever found. By the time 50 years had passed, since Flight 305, the world that had once searched for D.B. Cooper had changed beyond recognition. Airports were now citadels of surveillance, their gates locked behind metal detectors and retinal scanners. Planes no longer carried staircases that opened to the air. Cash ransoms had been replaced by encrypted wire transfers. And yet, through all that change, the question that began on a rain-soaked evening in 1971 remained unaltered. Who was the man who stepped into the clouds and vanished? In 2010's America, the case existed simultaneously as investigation, entertainment, and folk memory. Streaming documentaries reanimated the story for a generation who had never known flight without security checkpoints. Each production revisited the same sequence of images: the gray sky, the black tie, the bourbon glass, the open door. The music swelled, the camera lingered, and for a moment the viewer felt they were there, in that cabin filled with cigarette smoke and static electricity, watching a man quietly defy gravity. The moment still worked. It still carried power, but it no longer felt like crime. It felt like cinema. New suspects surfaced with the rhythm of seasons. A retired Army paratrooper in Oregon, a former railroad worker in California, a reclusive man in Arizona, who left behind an old parachute and a pile of spent 20s. Each claim arrived with confidence, and each dissolved under scrutiny. DNA analysis remained the ultimate test, and every time it said no, the partial genetic sample, preserved from the tie, had become the final gatekeeper, the last objective measure in a story built from speculation. No match was ever found. The sample itself, degraded and finite, could offer only exclusion, never confirmation. Even science, in the end, became part of the silence. The geography of the case changed too. Where once the forests were wild and uncharted, now they were mapped by satellites, dissected by GPS. Still, hikers occasionally stumbled on debris, a shred of canvas, a buckle, a tangle of cord. Every find was photographed, tested, dismissed. No one ever found a parachute, a skeleton, or a trace of the ransom beyond the rotted bills of Tenna Bar. Nature had erased its witness long ago. For the FBI, the investigation's closure did not end responsibility. Requests for information continued to arrive. Journalists seeking access, filmmakers requesting confirmation, enthusiasts hoping for a hint. The Bureau's replies remained uniform. The case was administratively closed, evidence preserved, subject unidentified. Behind that official phrasing lay a quiet acceptance that some mysteries cannot be reduced to record. The man who called himself Dan Cooper had passed beyond jurisdiction into the realm of memory, but the public refused finality. In the years after closure, citizen investigators formed digital networks. They pooled satellite maps, flight data, and weather archives. They reconstructed trajectories using mathematical models unavailable in Their conclusions mirrored those of the original investigators. The most probable jump zone lay near the Lewis River. The most probable outcome was death. And yet, despite agreement, the fascination only grew stronger. The collective imagination had less interest in answers than in endurance. It was not resolution that drew people back. It was the idea that the mystery still resisted them. To understand the Cooper case was to understand the culture that built it. America had always been drawn to the frontier, to the line between what was known and what could not be proved. In that sense, D.B. Cooper became its last frontier story. A man who slipped the net not by violence or brilliance, but by simplicity. He used no disguise, no accomplice, no plan of escape beyond the jump itself. He entered history through paperwork, and left it through weather. He represented the possibility that control was still human, that a man could step away from the system, and vanish by will alone. Each generation redefined him. To some, he was a criminal, who exploited trust. To others, a tactician who mastered chaos. To many, he was neither, merely a mirror held up to their own idea of freedom. The myth was never about who he was, but what he meant. He had taken something intangible, not just money or an aircraft, but certainty. And certainty, once stolen, could not be recovered. By 2021, the 50th anniversary of the hijacking, journalists revisited the case with a kind of reverence. The surviving crew members, now in their 80s, were interviewed in softened light, their recollections steady but blurred by time. They spoke of professionalism, of calm, of a man who had frightened them, not by threat but by control. Their memories matched in tone, but not in detail. Their voices shaped by half a century of retelling. Each pause, each glance downward, carried the weight of having witnessed something singular, an event that refused to end. At the commemoration events held across the Pacific Northwest, the air was filled with nostalgia. Old news footage played on screens, black and white images of the 727, parked on the tarmac, agents walking through rain in trench coats. Children who had grown up hearing the story stood beside their grandparents, watching documentaries, projected on barn walls. The myth had become inheritance, a story passed through families like an heirloom of collective uncertainty. Meanwhile, forensic science continued to test the boundaries of what could still be learned. Microscopic residue from the tie underwent another round of elemental analysis, identifying compounds linked to aerospace adhesives and cutting tools. Details that narrowed nothing, but hinted at precision. The results were released quietly, published in technical bulletins, rather than headlines. Even the scientists understood the pattern now. Every answer simply revealed a new question. The Cooper mystery endured not because of what was missing, but because of what remained visible. The exactness of what was known. A man bought a ticket in Portland. He boarded Flight 305 to Seattle. He demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000. He released the passengers. He took off again. He jumped into a storm and disappeared. That framework, simple, symmetrical, complete, carried its own gravity. It was the perfect shape for an unsolved story, balanced between precision and void. In time, the case came to represent something more than crime. It became a reminder that even in an age of absolute record-keeping, mystery could survive. That a file marked unsolved could remain untouched by time, not because of failure, but because of its perfection as an enigma. To close it would have meant destroying the one thing everyone agreed upon, that the unknown, in rare cases, deserves to remain unknown. Half a century after the hijacking, the image still endures. The rain, the red lights on the wings, the hum of engines over the Pacific Northwest. Somewhere in that storm, a man stands at the open stairway, coat pressed by wind, tie fluttering, hand gripping the bag. Behind him, the cabin glows dimly. Before him, darkness expands without horizon. He does not hesitate. He steps forward and vanishes into air, leaving only the sound of wind and the faint echo of freedom. The rain never left the Pacific Northwest. It still falls in thin veils. Over Portland, over the Lewis River, over the gray forests that stretch toward the Columbia. The land has changed. Highways now trace the ridgelines where helicopters once hovered. Subdivisions rise where search camps once stood. But the sound of water remains the same. It is the only thing that still connects the present to the night. A man vanished from the sky. The FBI vault remains sealed and sterile, climate controlled to the decimal. Inside, the evidence sits preserved in silence. A narrow black tie rests beneath glass, its fibers threaded with titanium dust that still glints faintly under the ultraviolet lamp. Beside it, the shrunken brown bundles of $20 bills lie flat, numbered and logged. Their serials still match the old list, a sequence frozen in order, untouched by time. These are all that remain of a man once described as calm, courteous, and deliberate. No name, no body, no motive. Only artifacts, small enough to fit in a briefcase, heavy enough to anchor a half-century of speculation. Each item bears the weight of 1,000 retellings. Every mark, every fiber, every photograph has been studied until it transcended meaning. The investigators who handled them are gone now. The last agents who walked the field north of Ariel have long since retired, their field notes digitized into quiet permanence. What began as pursuit became preservation. What began as evidence became relic. Even the official word, unsolved, has faded into a kind of respect. To speak of D.B. Cooper now is not to discuss a crime, but to acknowledge a story that refused to end. History has reduced the hijacking to sequence. A 4-hour line of events, as clean as a diagram. 2:57 p.m. ticket purchase, 3:02 p.m. takeoff, 5:45 landing, 7:36 p.m. second departure, 8:11 jump. Beyond that, there is nothing measurable. No sound recorded, no image captured, no trace found. The timeline stops mid-air, cut cleanly at the moment of the leap. It is the purest unsolved event in modern history, an act that erases itself in its execution. A man steps into wind and becomes absence. The forests below that night have long forgotten. Storms came and went, rivers changed course, fires burned and regrew. Whatever fell from that aircraft, man, parachute, money, has been swallowed by decades of rain and root. Nature does not archive, it erases, yet the story survived, not in soil, but in imagination. Each generation rebuilt him in its own likeness. For the 1970s Perseverance, he was rebellion. For the 1980s, Ducumbi Sebingence, Ducumbi Sebingence, Ducumbi Sebingence, Ducumbi Sebingence, Ducumbi Sebingence, Diamachi pain, nostalgia. For the digital age, he became code, a mystery that could be endlessly reloaded, analyzed, never resolved. The legend aged perfectly, because it never aged at all. It remained locked in November 1971, in that cabin lit by orange bulbs and cigarette smoke, in the space between a man's decision and its consequence. Every image of him returns to that seat. Row 18, aisle, dark suit, white shirt, black tie, hands steady, gaze level, the faint reflection of cabin light in his glasses. The note folded once, precise, the bourbon untouched, condensation forming a ring on the tray. In that stillness lies everything: calculation, composure, and the calm of a man whose plan ends with disappearance. It is the only moment history ever owned of him, and it is enough. 50 years later, the name D.B. Cooper means many things, and nothing at once. It belongs to no single man. It is an echo of every unsolved story, the intersection where fact and myth exchange identities. He has become the patron saint of uncertainty, the ghost of possibility, the proof that not every question must be answered to endure. The unsolved is its own kind of immortality. In the archives, the lights dim automatically after hours. Rows of sealed evidence boxes stand in silence. Somewhere among them lies the file stamped Norjack, Northwest hijacking. The paper inside still carries the smell of carbon copy and typewriter ink. The ink will fade, the fibers will crumble, but the story will remain, sustained by repetition, kept alive by the simple act of not knowing. The mystery has long outlived the investigation, but it has also outlived the need for truth. Outside, the rain falls over the same riverbanks, where a boy once found money in the sand. It falls over the same airports, now changed beyond recognition. It falls over empty air, the space where a Boeing once flew south, its cabin lights glowing through storm. And in that space, preserved somewhere between history and legend, a man still steps through an open door into darkness. He is forever midair, not ascending, not descending, not landing, just suspended in the exact moment when freedom and oblivion become the same thing. That is where he remains. That is where the story ends. And that is why, after half a century, the name D.B. Cooper still means not who, but what it means to disappear.